Hi, everyone. Welcome. If you're just joining us, we're going to give everyone a minute to log in, get comfortable, get settled, and sit back for the presentation that we're going to do today to prepare you for the grant-making busy season time of year. There's a question in the chat. Thank you very much, Elon, for jumping in there. Where are you joining from, and what is the weather like? All right. So it's it's summer in the United States, and it's also the time of year when we look to making our end of year deadlines for the grant making payments. So this webinar is designed to prepare you for that and give you some general knowledge about the ED process based on IRS requirements and guidelines when granting internationally. So we're going to cover the reasons, requirements, benefits, and potential challenges of EDs and touch on a few unusual circumstances. We're also going to provide some tools and strategies to help you and your team assess whether an organization is a good candidate for ED or ER and how to effectively support NGOs throughout the ED process. So all those decisions, those tools of the trade, just designed to ensure that we're getting the grantees and NGOs on the right track early on in the busy season. So for those who have not yet met, I'm Jonathan Fairhead, Senior Director at NGOsource. I have great privilege of working with many of you as a sort of a liaison for your relationship with NGOsource. I also work with our network of global partners. Really proud of the fact that NGOsource has a global network of partners on the ground supporting NGOs through the ED process. And we always remind ourselves that as much as our job is to work with the grant makers and ensure the ED gets done, the NGOs outside of the United States, they're equally our clients, if not more so, which is why our name is NGOsource. So I have the great privilege of working very closely with Tamara Dalul, who many of you know. She leads our outreach and grant maker responses along with her team. And so she'll be working on the presentation today. And then I can also introduce our new managing counsel of NGOsource, Michael Demian. He's a veteran ED lawyer. He joined us in March of 2020. Very interesting time to start a new job. And he's been a member of our legal team since then. And now he oversees our entire legal team and all of our ED processes. Next slide, please, for a picture of Tamara and Michael. So there we go. And over to you, Michael. If you could lead the lecture. Just a little, sorry, before we do that, a bit of housekeeping. We're going to have time for Q&A at the end of this presentation. If you could drop your questions in the Q&A function, we'll keep track of those and respond to them at the end of the session. Or you can use the chat, whatever's easiest. And that's it. Take it away, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next slide, please. As Jonathan mentioned, I am the new managing counsel of NGOsource. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy that all of you are here. I think this is a very important session to attend, especially as we come up on year-end busy season. As Jonathan mentioned, I have been with NGOsource and TechSoup for over 5 years now. In that time, I've seen a tremendous amount of growth. I've also seen a lot of collaboration with our partners, and I hope that I know many of you are aware of the transition that NGOsource has gone through, and I hope that as we move forward, we will continue to be a good resource for all of you, and that we will provide excellent service in terms of equivalency determinations and other needs regarding your international giving. So this session is designed to help prepare you for the busy season that's ahead, which is usually between September and December. The reason for that is a lot of organizations will have EDs that expire at the end of December, and many organizations, foundations that have requested EDs will want those EDs to be renewed. there are also a lot of new EDs that we received during that time. So we've termed that period between September and December as our busy season. We are busy throughout the year, so it's a little bit of a misnomer, but this is the busiest because most organizations have fiscal year end dates of December 31st, which means that in order to renew, we'd have to do that before the end of the year. So some things that we can plan on to get there and to make things easier for you as the grant makers and for us as the reviewers. We'll try to touch upon some of those things today. Some questions you can ask the NGOs, some ways that you can pre-vet the organizations to determine whether they have the ability to meet the ED requirements. And that should give us a good head start on the busy season. Next slide, please. What I'm going to do is discuss the 3 tests that an organization has to go through to achieve a successful ED. These are the same 3 tests that a US 501c3 charity would have to pass in order to be certified as, or in order to achieve the 501c3 status. As most of you know, an equivalency determination is a process that non-US organizations must go through in order to be deemed equivalent to a US 501c3 public charity. The reason that's important is because it allows private foundations or other grant makers to be able to donate to international entities, just like they would a US 501c3 public charity. So if you're a foundation and you have minimum contributions that you must make every year, and you have organizations that meet your international strategy for giving, you can freely donate to those organizations just like you would a US 501c3 public charity and still receive the credit for that contribution. What makes this process different is that those organizations, once they're certified, go into a repository and are accessible to other grant makers. And it's also easier than the alternative, which is the ER process, which I'll discuss later on in this presentation. Now, the 3 steps that an organization has to go through and pass is the organizational test, the operational test, and the public support test. Next slide, please. In summary, this 3-pronged test, as I'll call it, requires certain things to be achieved in order for an organization to pass each one of these tests. I'll start with the organizational test. An organizational test is examining whether an organization is organized for charitable purposes. In order to do that, we highly depend on the governing documents of that organization. So when we look through the governing documents, we're looking for a few things. The first thing that we're looking for is the objectives. The objectives through the IRS regulations require that the organization's objectives be stated explicitly in the governing document. So when we review the objectives, we want to see that those objectives are indeed charitable. The next thing we look for is how the organization's assets are used. So an organization's governing document might have a clause that specifically addresses how the assets can be used. For example, it might say something like, income and assets shall always be used to support the organization's goals. That's a very clear and concise asset use clause, which can resolve a lot of issues that we might encounter throughout the ED process. So that clause is very important. It doesn't have to always be there, but it is very helpful if it is there. Part of the asset use clause or asset use in general is what happens to the organization's assets upon dissolution. This is a very important piece of passing the organizational test, and it's also one of the most problematic pieces, which I'll discuss the reasons why later. But the dissolution clause ensures that the organization's assets will continue to be used in perpetuity for charitable purposes. The other thing that we look for in the governing document is that there's no private benefit. Unlike the first 2, where the statements have to be explicitly included in the governing document, the no private benefit requirement based on IRS regulations only requires that there is no language that explicitly allows for private benefit. So what we're doing in this scenario is we're looking to make sure there is no problematic language in the governing document. If there is helpful language, that is great. We will include that. That makes the argument more defensible. But the requirement is that there's no language that actually points to private benefit. Now, for the operational test, we do something a little different. While we still heavily rely on the governing documents and what's stated in there, the operational test is more about what the organization does on a day-to-day basis. What are their activities? A lot of times that might differ slightly from their objectives. The reason for that can be many things. An organization might have been established decades ago when objectives were different. The organization clearly has grown since then. The world has changed. So their activities on a day-to-day basis, based on growth, based on external factors, might be slightly different or significantly different than the objectives stated in the governing documents. Nonetheless, their activities also need to be charitable. So we examine things like the responses in the questionnaire, where the organization can summarize their past, present, and future activities. We look at the website to see what kind of activities the organization is actually engaged in and what things they like to highlight. We look at their mission statement. We look at an annual report, and if they are able to provide that, to see what kind of activities were highlighted there. So those are ways that we would examine the organization's activities to make sure they are charitable, and so the organization can pass the operational test. Other things we look for are prohibited activities. So if in the process of looking through a website or an annual report, or even the questionnaire responses, if we see any activity related to political campaigning or a substantial amount of lobbying, then that could be problematic, and that could possibly be the determining factor on whether an organization will pass the ED process or not. Finally, we look at the public support test. Now, not all organizations have to go through the public support test. I'll discuss that in another slide, but most organizations do. This is a snapshot of their income over the past 5 fiscal years. If they are a new organization, we look at projected income. The IRS rule is that an organization, in order to be deemed equivalent to a U.S. public charity or to be deemed a public charity in the U.S., they must have at least a third of their income coming from the public. And by the public, we mean government agencies, individual donors to a certain extent, U.S. public charities, organizations that are deemed to be charitable. They could also be organizations that are in the repository. If we, NGOsource, are reviewing the organization, if we would have certified an organization that to be equivalent to U.S. public charity, we can count that as public support. What they don't count are individual private donors to a certain extent as well, private foundations, private companies. And so in order to reach that 33 1/3%, we do look at the public, what constitutes public giving and the income that's coming from the public. Now, the 33 1/3% is the ultimate goal that an organization should be achieving. However, many organizations, especially newer ones, might not reach that level. So in those scenarios, the IRS allows a second bite of the apple, so to speak. If the organization's public support is at least over 10%, but still under 33 1/3%, an organization can still pass ED. However, they have to go through a facts and circumstances analysis. Most organizations will pass the facts and circumstances analysis. It's very rare that an organization will not be certified based on facts and circumstances alone. But nonetheless, that is something to keep in mind, that if that organization's public support is between the 10% and 33 1/3% range, then they would have to go through another analysis, which is called facts and circumstances. Another thing to keep in mind is if an organization's public support is less than 33 1/3, there is a higher chance of tipping. What I mean by tipping is tipping into private foundation status. So if an organization, let's say, is at the 12% mark or 15% mark, and they are highly dependent on private funds, well, upon renewal, that ED will last roughly 2 years. Within that 2-year period, upon renewal, when the organization now has another year of income, if they haven't changed their income stream and are still dependent on private funds, they could potentially fall below the 10% mark, which means that they would no longer be be deemed equivalent to a public charity, and they would fall under private foundation status, which could affect your giving strategy. So that's something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at pre-screening tools for candidates, it's important to realize that some of the questions that we're going to be going through here today are not the entire list of questions that you should be asking or can be asking NGOs. They're just certain things that we see on a daily basis that could have helped the ED go through the process faster. Things that we see that are common issues. So we're going to try to address some of those and highlight those today. But keep in mind that that is not the entire list. Another thing that I wanted to point out is some organizations will reach out to NGOsource and ask if we can do a quick scan of an organization's governing document to estimate their chances of passing an ED. We are more than happy to do that. I know my predecessor Martha did that, and I'm happy to continue that tradition. But please keep in mind that the review of the governing document will only address the organizational test. In order to guarantee that an organization will pass the ED process and be deemed equivalent to a public charity, it needs to pass all three tests: organizational, operational, and public support, if that's applicable. So while it's informative, it's not conclusive. So again, we'd be happy to do that, but just keep in mind that that only gives you one snapshot of one of the tests, and there's no guarantee that the organization would pass. Next slide, please. So right now we'll go through some preliminary questions that you can ask NGOs in your pre-vetting process. Next slide. So the first question is, has the organization already been recognized by the U.S. Internal Revenue Service as tax exempt under Code Section 501c? This is important because if an organization already has 501c3 status, there's no need for an ED. An ED is designed to examine organizations that do not have the 501c3 status and are non-U.S. organizations. U.S. organizations always have the opportunity to go through the three-pronged test and achieve a determination letter from the IRS. That is more challenging for non-U.S. organizations, and in fact quite rare. The only times that usually happens is if there's some kind of nexus to a U.S. organization. They have a U.S. registration somehow. If their board members are U.S. based, there's certain very rare circumstances where a non-U.S. organization can achieve that 501c3 status. Nonetheless, it does happen. So it is advisable to check things like GuideStar, Charity Navigator. The IRS sometimes has a list of I don't know how updated it is, but there is a list of 501c3 organizations on the IRS website. But I always find things like GuideStar or Charity Navigator to be the most up to date. That's a good way to find out if an organization is 501c3, if they already have a 501c3 status. Now, if an organization has another 501c status, such as a 501c4 or a 501c6, that is also important to keep in mind. Even if an organization goes through the ED process and one of our attorneys determines that this organization is indeed equivalent to a US 501c3 public charity, our determination doesn't mean anything compared to the IRS determination letter. The ED determination, the end result is a legal opinion that U.S. grant makers can rely on for the 2-year period, that it's valid. It is a snapshot of what the organization's profile looks like in that moment that the certification was made. So any changes within that 2-year period don't necessarily count. Once an organization gets renewed, we re-examine the organization to make sure there's no material changes. That legal opinion is something you can rely on, and we do a very good job in making sure that we've covered all our bases, so it is a defensible argument. Nonetheless, if the IRS has determined something different, since that is the body that would eventually challenge an ED through an audit and would require us to defend an ED, the IRS is the is where the buck stops. That is the agency that determines how an organization is classified. So if they've already determined an organization is classified as some other 501c, then that trumps the ED determination or the ED legal opinion, and that ED is no longer valid. So that's something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that the public support test doesn't apply to all organizations. Most organizations will need to go through the public support test, except if they fall under one of these categories. If they're a school, a religious organization, a hospital or medical organization, or a supporting organization. I'll walk through each of these just briefly. I won't go into a lot of detail, but one of the things you can do in pre-vetting is to, if you feel like the organization falls under one of these categories, or if the organization identifies itself as one of these categories, keep in mind that the ED process requires it to still go through the organizational test and the operational test. It does not require it to go through the public support test. However, there is a separate analysis for each one of these different entity types. So for example, a school will require that it has a formal curriculum, a faculty, a student body who attends classes at a physical location. A religious organization will require that that organization has a religious code or doctrine, a congregation of members, a physical place of worship. These are a few examples of the analyses that pertain to these entity types. Hospitals will require that there is a physical location that also includes mobile clinics, that they employ physicians, that the physicians don't have a separate way of charging patients. It's a plus if the hospital or physician treats patients that are low income or treats patients at no cost. It's a plus if that organization has an emergency room. So things like that. We look at various attributes that are identified in the IRS regulations to prove that an organization does in fact meet the requirements of these specific entity types. Supporting organizations are interesting because an organization, through its activities, will be very clear that they only support, their existence is only to support a specific organization. However, US law requires that that specific organization be clearly stated in the organization's objectives. So if an organization that's being supported is not stated in that objective, then it will be very difficult to count that organization as a supporting org. Now, if any one of these organizations cannot pass the individual analysis that is specific to this entity type, we will try to find other ways to certify the organization. We might turn to public support to see if we can go through the public support test, acquire the information from the organizations, their income, and attempt to certify the organization that way. If an organization is formed through legislative act or some other government act, we might see if we can certify it as a government instrumentality. And that's important to know because when you do your pre-vetting, you'll want to see how closely these organizations achieve these attributes of the individual entity types. If they do not achieve these, or if it seems like it might be borderline, you might consider the fact that NGOsource might require a different type of analysis. So keeping that in mind will help you ask the right questions to almost ensure that the organization can pass the ED one way or another. Next slide, please. Another question is the organization an independent legal entity as opposed to a program or project of another entity? I'll give an example of a situation where this might apply. Let's say there's an organization established in France. It's established as an association in France. It meets all the requirements of the organizational, operational, public support test. The organization's objectives are to engage in farming and sustainable consumption and environmental work having to do with climate change. They are specifically focused or highly focused in South American countries, and they've established various offices in South America. Now, let's say the grant maker comes to us and says they want us to certify that specific office in Peru, because they're very interested in the programs in Peru, and it matches with their international giving strategy. Well, that can be problematic if the organization is just a program linked to the parent company in France. If it's not, while the organization might have government approval for setting up a presence in Peru, it might not have the actual authority to engage in various other types of functions, such as raising money, such as providing income to, or providing grants to other organizations to engage in programs without government authority. So there could be situations where the government has authorized an international organization to have a presence, but it doesn't go beyond that. If an organization is not allowed to become its own entity, or just hasn't gone through the steps to become its own entity, then it will be very difficult, if not impossible, for us to certify that organization. We can't look to the organizational test, or we can't look to governing documents for the organization to pass the organizational test. When we look at activities, that might be something that is that the organization can pass. But if it's highly linked to the parent organization, the organization might not have control over those activities. If we look at the income that the organization receives, if that income is largely coming from the parent organization, and that organization itself has not been certified as equivalent to a public charity, then we have a public support issue. So in those situations, the question to ask, if you're looking at, if you know an organization has a parent organization and you're looking at international subsidiary or office, the best question to ask is this just a program, or is this set up as a completely separate entity type in that country that you're interested in donating to? The solution here would be to simply certify the parent company. Once the parent company is certified, the grant maker can donate funds to that parent company and restrict funds for the specific programs in Peru or in any other country that the organization wants those funds to go to. Now, the issue here is, this is something that NGOsource would usually find, but once we find that issue and we present it to the grant maker as an option, it's in the last stage of the process. As my colleague Tamara will explain, there are several stages of the ED process. The legal review stage is the last stage. So at that point, several weeks have already gone by. We're now discovering this issue. We're now recommending to the grant maker that we certify the parent instead of the specific office that has been originally requested. And the process has to start all over again from the beginning, because now the parent has to provide their governing documents. They have to respond to the questionnaire responses about their activities. They have to provide their income. And so that process starts over and delays the entire ED certification. So this is an important question to know from the beginning. That way, if you find out that the parent organization is a better route to ensure that funds will go to the specific program that you're interested in, then you can start the ED request from the get-go, asking us to certify the parent organization. Next slide, please. Is the organization clearly organized as a for-profit commercial entity with traditional commercial programs and a shareholding structure that permits distribution of profits to shareholders or stockholders? Now, what this is referring to is the private benefit test. So as I mentioned before, unlike some of the other attributes of the organizational test, one of the things that makes the private benefit different is that we're not looking for language in the governing document. We're looking to make sure there is no language such as this in the governing document. Now, a lot of times an organization's governing document will go so far as to specifically say that the organization's assets will not be distributed to its members, that members do not have any right to their income or to the return of their contributions. That scenario is the ideal, because not only have we confirmed that private benefit language is not present in the document, but we actually have language to point to that specifically says that it is restricted and it is not allowed. So that makes the legal opinion that much more defensible and that much more compelling. A lot of times local law will actually support support this as well and restrict the organization's assets in that way as well. So that further makes the argument more compelling. Now, if we go through the governing documents and we find language such as this that is clearly related to private benefit, where there are shareholders, there are dividend payments, the shareholders are made up of individuals or private companies, there is a sort of profit share situation going on, then we know that private benefit is there and the organization will not pass the organizational test and by extension will not pass ED. There are rare circumstances where we can overcome this through an amendment. However, those are situations where an organization might have used a template as their governing document, or they're required to use a certain form, and this language is in there as part of that template or part of that form. In practice, the organization doesn't, in fact, have shareholders and doesn't engage in profit-sharing activities. If we discover that that is the case, we can ask an organization to prepare an amendment that nullifies those types of clauses. But again, if the organization is actually practicing this and they do have shareholders that engage in profit sharing, or the organization does provide dividend distributions, then that cannot be resolved by an amendment, because that would be restructuring the entire organization and the way that they're registered and set up. So that would not be realistic. So nonetheless, this is language to look for in the governing document. And if you don't have a copy of the governing document, it's an easy question that you can ask the NGO just to make sure that private benefit will not be an issue. Next slide, please. Now I'll talk about some of the common ED challenges that we encounter when we review organizations, and terminology that could be a little fuzzy. So the first thing would be charitable versus nonprofit. Those definitions can vary based on jurisdiction, based on the country that the organization is located in. Dissolution, although it's one small part of the organizational test, it does have great value in that it ensures that the organization's assets will continue to be used for charitable purposes into perpetuity. So if there's an issue with the dissolution clause or the way that it's phrased, and it doesn't meet US legal requirements, then that could be problematic. Lobbying, an organization can engage in lobbying so long as it's not a substantial part of their activities. Lobbying also holds a specific definition, so we'll review that. And of course, public support. Next slide, please. Next slide. So does the organization have a purpose or objective statement in its governing documents that describes a charitable mission or objective? So one thing to keep in mind is the definition of charitable in the US, based on US law, is very broad. So it includes things that are listed here: education, religion, culture, promotion of health, combating community deterioration. Sometimes it also includes sports or activities for youth. So it encompasses quite a range of different types of objectives and activities. And so what happens is, in many other countries, the term charitable only applies to certain activities, such as, for example, relief of the poor. If the organization feels that they do not fit that very specific definition in their country, they will say in the questionnaire that they are not charitable, that 90% of their activities are not charitable, that they're not organized for charitable purposes. Of course, when we see those kind of responses, that is problematic. We have to then follow up with the organization to confirm what it is, why are they responding in that way. In that communication, we will inform the NGO of the US definition of charitable and the many broad categories that it encompasses. And when the organization is now knowledgeable about the US definition of charitable, they will then change the responses. And in most cases, the organization will indeed be a charitable organization based on the US definition. Now, this is important to keep in mind, because when you pre-vet organizations, you might want to ask them, what do they think about the definition of charitable as it applies to them, as it applies to their local law? do they feel that their organization is charitable? That is an opportunity to educate that organization on the US definition of charitable and to inform them that the US definition is actually quite broad, and their activities more than likely do fall under the US definition. So they should answer the questions in the NGOsource questionnaire accordingly based on this definition and their knowledge of it. That will save the ED reviewers a lot of time. The legal opinion would be drafted faster than it would ordinarily be if we had to follow up and confirm these responses. Next question, please. I'm sorry, next slide, please, which is also a question. Does the organization distribute profits or dividends to its founders, shareholders, or members other than as payments for services? Now, we've already covered this in the private benefit, so I'll move on to the next question. Next slide, please. Does the organization substantially engage in direct communication with legislators in attempts to influence legislation? Now, this is referring to lobbying. Lobbying is not a complete bar. An organization can engage in lobbying so long as it's not a substantial part of their activities. We've determined that to be about the 5% mark, that they don't dedicate more than 5% of their resources to lobbying activities. Now, this is the reverse of charitable. The US definition is actually quite narrow compared to the way other countries might view the term lobbying. An organization might have lobbying as one of its objectives. That could raise red flags. However, if you in your pre-vetting are able to inform the NGO or educate them on the US definition, that could save the ED review process a lot of time because we would not have to confirm the activities that the organization has determined do fall under lobbying. In the US, an organization has to be in direct contact with a lawmaker for the purpose of influencing legislation, or it has to be in direct contact with the public, encouraging them to have direct contact with a lawmaker for the purpose of influencing legislation. Other forms of activities such as advocacy, public awareness, research, education, training, even educating lawmakers on certain policies in the hopes of changing legislation. Those types of things would fall under an exception. So once again, the US definition is very narrow. Other countries might consider advocacy or public awareness or any one of those other things that I mentioned as lobbying. So they might answer the question that they do engage in lobbying substantially, but they're basing it on the definition in their country. If we're able to inform them ahead of time that the US definition is more narrow, then we can have correct responses and the ED process will go by faster. Next question, next slide. Now, this is referring to public campaigning. Does the organization ever directly or indirectly support or oppose candidates for public office? Unlike lobbying, there is a complete ban on political campaigning. So an organization cannot engage in political campaigning whatsoever in order to be deemed equivalent to a public charity. So this is an important question because if an organization does engage in this kind of activity, whether it's under US law or under their local law, that is a complete ban. So this will help you determine ahead of time whether it's worth it to put the organization through an ED process. Next slide. Now, things to keep in mind for dissolution. There is certain terminology that can make or break a dissolution clause. The term nonprofit. In the US, the term nonprofit can be either charitable or non-charitable. There are many nonprofit organizations that are one or the other. In other countries, in some other countries, the term nonprofit is equivalent to charitable. So they might intend in their dissolution clause that assets be distributed to another charitable organization, but they're using the term nonprofit. Because that is a legal term, we have to rely on what the US legal definition is of that term. And because it can go either way, charitable or non-charitable, that term is not acceptable. Same thing with similar purposes. There is an IRS ruling that has determined that similar purposes is too general. The example I like to give is sports. If there's an organization that's engaged in promoting sports for youth in low-income neighborhoods, that can be seen as charitable. An organization that devotes its income to a professional profit-making athletic team, that is not charitable. But they are both similar because arguably, they both engage in the same sport. So the IRS has determined that because the term similar is problematic, it cannot be acceptable. Many organizations, this is probably the lead issue we see with dissolution clauses, is that the use of the term similar. Oftentimes, we can rely on that asset use clause that I referred to earlier that dedicates the organization's assets to its own purposes to overcome this issue. But other times we will, or local law that says the same thing, but other times we will require an organization to go through an amendment. So to the extent that you can discover this issue ahead of time, could be the determining factor on whether you want to pursue ED or ER. Next slide, please. Lobbying, I already discussed what is allowed and what is not allowed. So just know the key takeaway here is that the definition is more narrow in the US than it is in many other countries. Next slide. The public support test, we did discuss this in the beginning, but one thing to keep in mind is if an organization does not pass the public support test, which is the lead reason why we would deny an ED certification to an organization. There are many reasons, but the main one that we're finding is issues with public support. So an organization might still pass organizational tests and operational tests, but they won't pass the public support test. We'd still provide an analysis to you because that could help with the ER process. But it is a shame if this is the one thing that is preventing an organization from passing. Things to ask if they fall under the 10% mark is, was their income misclassified? Sometimes an organization will classify their income based on our definition of those income or their own definition of income, but it doesn't comply or doesn't correlate with the US definition of different income categories. So that's something to look into. Were major donors properly listed? Sometimes an organization will assume we're only looking for recent donors, not 5-year donors. So those organizations, if they're able to go back 5 years and include organizations that could count towards public support, that would help increase it. I know we're running out of time, so I will move on to the next slide and quickly mention that the alternative is expenditure responsibility. This is always an alternative, and it might be useful to advise NGOs of this. It is more laborious. It does require the NGO to go through many reports and extreme monitoring of those grant funds. So the ED process does resolve this and does provide an avenue where grant makers and NGOs don't have to go through this laborious process. But it would be useful to advise an NGO that this is an alternative. I will then now turn the presentation to Tamara.
Thank you, Michael. Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm going to share, a snapshot of what the ED process looks like. The current ED process will begin by a grant maker placing the ED request in their grant maker portal. Once you place that ED request, the NGO will receive an invitation email letting them know that they can access their portal and begin filling out their questionnaire. And at the same time, the global partner that is assigned to them will receive an email letting them know that, there's an organization that's been assigned to them to reach out and provide support. So the organization is going through the questionnaire and reaches out to us or the global partner that's been assigned to them if they have any questions or if they need support before submitting. They then submit the questionnaire and it'll go through 2 layers of review. One, preliminary review, which is essentially when someone from our operations team will do a scan of all of the information submitted, the documentation submitted, and they might follow up with the organization if additional information is needed. But essentially what they're doing is preparing the file for the attorney to then do their legal review and draft that analysis. So once that file is ready, it'll then get moved to legal review. It'll be assigned to one of the attorneys on our team, and they will work on the analysis, and they also may follow up with the organization if additional information is needed. And this is just to highlight the various touch points that we have with the organization. Me and my team, we like to reassure organizations that we're never going to assume the information that's been submitted. We will always follow up and make sure that they've fully understood the information that they're submitting. And so once the legal review is finalized, someone from our operations team will come in and conduct the certification process. Once that's done, the grant maker will receive an email letting them know that the certificate, analysis, and supporting documentation is ready for them to access via their grant maker portal. At the same time, the organization will receive an email congratulating them on their ED status and a badge, so like a photo, that they can use on their website to notify other grant makers that they have an ED on file with NGOsource. Next slide, please. And so I briefly touched upon this, but we have 13 global partners, and our global partners are making sure that the organization gets empathetic and timely support, whether it's in their geographic location or in the language that they're most comfortable communicating in. This is a list of all our current global partners and where they're located in. Organizations will get assigned based on the language that you select in your grantmaker portal. So for example, if you select Spanish and the organization's in Mexico, it'll get assigned to our global partner, SEMEFI in Mexico. So based on time zone, geographic location, as well as languages. We also support organizations in the following languages. Organizations can go through the ED questionnaire in those languages as well. And this is such an important touch because, as you all know, the ED process is quite a US-centric tax law lens of looking at an organization. So making sure that the organization is comfortable and has the support that they need localized is very important to us. Next slide, please. And so we have some recommendations going into busy season. So if you require your EDs to be completed before December 31st, we highly encourage you to submit your ED requests no later than September 30th. This will allow for some time in case there's follow-up, but of course our turnaround times are fully dependent on the organization's responsiveness to our follow-up questions. We're currently estimating new EDs to currently take up to 8 weeks and renewals to take up to 6 weeks. And we're, of course, working on making sure to get those numbers lower. That is our goal. These are our current estimates. You currently can select Expedite as an add-on when you're placing the ED request, which is a new feature in our grantmaker portal. Expedited EDs will be an additional $500, and we aim to finalize expedited new ED requests in 4 weeks, expedited renewal ED requests in 3 weeks. So some tips on how to prepare your grantees. Make sure that you notify them that you'll be requesting an ED and that they should expect an invitation email from us and from the global partner that's been assigned to them, just so they're in the loop, as well as, if you plan to expedite, to let them know ahead of time and make sure that, they feel comfortable with that and are ready for that. Make sure that you have updated contact information. So when you're placing the ED request, you have the option to add contact information to ones that we already have on file for a renewal. And for a new, you'll be adding contact information. So make sure it's the appropriate person at the organization that will be going through the ED process. But, you can always reach out to us and we can add or edit the contact information all throughout the process. And then also encourage them to reach out to us directly at accountsupport@ngosource.org. We're here to help them. We're here to make your lives easier. And, as me and my team always say, we're happy to help. Next slide, please. And we have a learning center. Some of you may know it's available on our website, and it's a repository of helpful tools, links, resources for organizations and grant makers navigating the ED process. And many of them are translated in different languages. And, we hope to continue to add more and to add more languages as well as resources to our learning center. Next slide. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael and Tamara. That was excellent. Always good to revisit these topics and learn more, especially at this time of year. So we've got quite a few questions from the chat and from the Q&A function. I'm going to start with one from the chat, which is for you, Michael. Which category does service revenue fall into, public source or non-public?
I think it depends what's meant by service revenue. I'll assume that means revenue that's coming from a service that the NGO is providing to individuals or entities. So if, for example, an organization is engaging in some kind of consulting or some kind of training, and it's only one party that's benefiting from it, it's not the general public that's benefiting, then, and it's related to the organization's mission, then that income would fall under gross receipts from mission-related activities. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that if gross receipts is substantial, let's say 90% or more of the organization's total income, then that organization will be evaluated through the 509A2 process, not 509A1. 509A1 is the category that involves the traditional public support analysis. 509A2 looks at organizations that have payors more than they have grantors. Grantors are freely giving money without anything in return. Payors have something coming in return, such as a service or a product, or things like admissions to events. So if the majority of the income is coming from that category, then we'll have to put the organization through a separate analysis. It doesn't mean they won't pass. It just means that there's a separate way of looking at their financial statements. Another thing to keep in mind about gross receipts, this is an easy place. I mentioned in a previous slide that sometimes if an organization is less than 10%, it could be that they're misclassifying their income. This is the most common place that organizations would misclassify. They would count a lot of times. I don't know if it's based on the local definition of these income categories or just the way that it's stated in our documents, but an organization might mistakenly consider gross receipts for mission-related activities as their total income or as their grant income. And so if you see that figure being unusually high, or that line item being unusually high, and you have knowledge that the organization does indeed depend on a lot of grant income, there could be a mistake there that is affecting the public support percentage. One thing I didn't touch on before is when we look at major donors, this is a separate topic, but I think it's worth mentioning. If an organization is below the 10% mark and they have listed their major donors over the past 5 years, a question to ask is, how long have these donors been grant makers for this organization? If there is a grant maker that has suddenly appeared in the past year or so and provided an unusually large grant to an organization, and that one large grant is what's causing the organization to drop below the 10% mark, the IRS allows us to view that large grant, so long as it's unexpected, as an unusual grant. And that means that for that review, we can eliminate that grant from the review process and have it not count towards the public support percentage. So that way, by removing it, there's a chance the organization can be within that range of passing the public support test. So that's something to keep in mind.
Thank you so much, Michael. Next up, we have two related questions, very timely for this time of year. The one is there a difference between renewing an ED before they expire and after they expire? And then I'm just going to lead into the next question as well. And that person is saying, our foundation supports 3 NGOs that have existing ED certificates that expire on December 31st, 2025. What's the timing recommendation for when to submit an ED renewal request to ensure there's no gap in coverage of the ED certification? And then this organization's board is going to meet in December and approve some grants. and they're hoping to get them paid in early 2026. So a recommendation on ED coverage, and then difference between new and renewal, and then also how to time an ED request for a renewal. And that's for you, Michael.
Those are really good questions. As Tamara mentioned, September 30th is the date that we would prefer. So if you are able to get your ED requests in before September 30th, then they will pretty much be guaranteed that they can be certified by December 31st. So there would not be a gap. If you happen to have those requests come in after September 30th, we will still do our very best to make sure that those organizations, those renewals are processed, but there is no guarantee if it comes in after September 30th. So the short answer is September 30th to be able to guarantee that the renewal is completed before December 31st and there is no gap. The next question is in terms of timing. It is a related question. If for some reason the ED is not certified before it is renewed, then what that means is once the ED expires, any grants going to that ED after that expiration date will have to go through the ER process until the ED becomes renewed. Then at that point, another 2-year mark begins, and then grants can continue to be provided to that NGO, just like they would have been done before. But in order to avoid that gap, I would highly recommend getting those ED requests in early.
Great, thank you so much. And this is actually something we discuss quite often with NGOs, with the grant makers specifically. So an ED is valid for 2 years since the last fiscal year that we have on record. That's why we do the renewal process. During the renewal process, the organization is asked to provide an additional 2 years of finances and certify that all of their previous documents were correct. So in this case, where the payment is going to be made in 2026, if you want to wait a couple of months into 2026 and request a renewal, then you might be able to time the ED to have it valid for all of 2026 and all of 2027. So there's some nuances there. We're happy to discuss them offline and continue that as well. Hope that's correct, Michael. We have one more question here. And this is definitely 2 more, sorry. Michael, in addition to the ED, is there a standard checklist or due diligence process to assess the eligibility of potential grantees to receive US funding? Also, are there specific considerations for anti-corruption or other compliance factors when a US grantee funds an entity outside the US for charitable purposes?
Well, the best checklist I would recommend is just the checklist of the 3-prong test, looking at what's required to meet the organizational test, the operational test, and the public support test. Using that in the form of a checklist would be really the best way to evaluate whether an organization has a good chance of passing the ED process. What we also provide as part of our service is we will do a sanctions check on an organization. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, we are now starting to also do sanctions checks on board members.
We do offer the option of an advanced sanction check on board members and key staff members for an extra $100 when you check out for a new or renewal ED.
So what that sanctions check does is it makes sure that the organization is not on any sort of anti-terrorism list, anti-fraud list, especially board members when it comes to anti-fraud. We also advise or provide notes for the grant maker if the organization's activities are in a sanctioned country or a sanction-related country. We will advise you of that when we issue the ED certificate so that you know how to best properly manage that kind of transfer of funds. This is usually more problematic if the organization is located in a sanctioned country. But nonetheless, even if it engages in activities in a sanctioned country but is located elsewhere, we will still advise you of that, so long as those countries are clearly identified in the questionnaire by the organization as a place that they engage in.
Right. So our very last question for our last minute, a very timely question indeed, which is also for you, Michael, is how should we discuss concerns on public support tests when many organizations are losing their government funding due to cuts to foreign aid? How would the facts and circumstance test apply to an organization that has lost any US Gov funding?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, this is the cuts are affecting a lot of organizations, and it's very unfortunate. If the organization's public support has dropped significantly, but they're still within the acceptable range, we can, like the question states, we can put the organization through a facts and circumstances analysis, and most likely they will pass. One thing to keep in mind, the main question to address is whether or not an organization has a plan or some kind of fundraising program to attract funds from the public. Technically, in the IRS regulations, that is not a facts and circumstance question. We post it as so in our questionnaire, but based on the regulations, that is the absolute question that needs to be answered in the affirmative before actually getting to the facts and circumstances questions, which are more about the organization's activities and how they serve the public and the governing board and so forth. So if you want to ensure that an organization will pass facts and circumstances, we have to first be able to get to the facts and circumstances questions. And that is through that first hurdle, which is making sure that the organization does have some sort of plan or program to attract public funds.
Thank you so much, Michael and Tamara. That was an excellent presentation. I learned a great deal. That is the end. As Tamara said, we are here to help. If you have any questions, please reach out to us directly. We have Michael and Tamara's email addresses here. And then, of course, account support at NGOsource.org, which reaches all of our team, Tamara, Michael, myself, and we all read those emails. Thank you very much. And you'll be receiving a recording of this meeting along with the tech shortly.
Thank you all.
Thank you.